Hello there. Welcome to this peaceful evening space we share together. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into one of the most charming mysteries of the 20th century, I want to check in with you. How are you feeling as this day draws to a close? Whether you're curious about the unexplained, perhaps a little tired from the day's adventures, or maybe just ready to settle into something wonderfully peculiar. All of these feelings are welcome here. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that sits at the very heart of what makes the paranormal so fascinating. Not because it's frightening, but because it's utterly, delightfully impossible. A story about a family, a remote farmhouse, and their most unusual house guest, who claim to be an extra clever mongoose. This is the story of Jeff, spelled G-E-F, pronounced Jeff, a talking mongoose who lived with the Irving family on the Isle of Man, from 1931 to 1945. For 14 years, this remarkable creature conversed with the family, entertained visitors, and baffled investigators from around the world. As we journey together through this extraordinary tale, you might notice your thoughts wandering. That's perfectly natural. If at any point your mind drifts away from our story, simply let it, and when you're ready, gently return to the little farmhouse called Cashin's Gap, where something wonderful and impossible was making itself at home. Take a moment to settle into your space. Feel your body being supported, like sinking into a comfortable chair by a warm fire on a cold island evening. Let yourself relax completely, knowing that for the next hour and a half you can simply listen and let this gentle mystery carry you wherever you need to go. The Isle of Man, a place where magic still lives. Picture, if you will, the Isle of Man in 1931, a small island floating in the Irish Sea, somewhere between England and Ireland, but belonging fully to neither. This is a place where ancient Celtic traditions still whisper through the heather, where fairy bridges span babbling brooks, and where the locals still tip their hats to the little people as they pass certain corners. The Isle of Man has always been a place apart, with its own government, its own language, its own customs that stretch back thousands of years. Here, the boundary between the everyday world and the realm of mystery has always been thinner, more permeable. It's the kind of place where impossible things might just be possible. On this magical island, in a remote valley called Dalby, stood a small stone farmhouse known as Cashin's Gap. The house was old, weathered by decades of Atlantic storms, its thick walls built to withstand the fierce winds that swept across the island. It was isolated, peaceful, the kind of place where a family could live quietly, undisturbed by the modern world. The farmhouse sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills covered in gorse and heather. Stone walls divided the landscape into small fields where sheep grazed peacefully. A narrow lane wound down from the main road, past ancient Celtic crosses, through stands of windswept trees, to the little house that would soon become famous around the world. But in 1931, Cashin's Gap was simply home to the Irving family. James Irving, a retired salesman in his 60s, his wife Margaret, a gentlewoman in her 50s, and their daughter Voiré, a bright 13-year-old girl who had lived her entire life in this quiet corner of the island. James Irving was a practical man. He had spent his working life dealing with facts, figures, the tangible world of commerce. He was not given to flights of fancy, not the sort of person who would make up stories or seek attention through elaborate hoaxes. He was, by all accounts, as solid and reliable as the stone walls of his farmhouse. Margaret Irving was known throughout the area as a kind, sensible woman. She tended her garden, kept her house, and raised her daughter with the quiet dignity of island folk. She attended the local church, participated in community events, and was respected by all who knew her, not the sort of person to fabricate tales or encourage nonsense. And Voiré. Young Voiré Irving was a typical island child in many ways. Intelligent, curious, but also practical like her parents. She helped with household chores, attended the local school, and knew every path and stone wall in the valley. She was, according to her teachers and neighbours, a perfectly ordinary, well-behaved girl. These three ordinary people, living their quiet life in their isolated farmhouse, were about to become part of one of the most documented, most investigated, and most charming paranormal cases of the 20th century. Because in September of 1931, something extraordinary moved into Cashen's Gap. The arrival of something impossible, it began, as many impossible things do, with the simplest of sounds. Strange noises in the walls, a scratching, tapping, pattering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The kind of sounds that old houses make, settling beams, mice in the walls, the natural music of a building that has stood for many years. At first, the Irving family paid little attention. Old farmhouses are full of sounds, especially on an island where the wind never truly stops blowing. But these sounds were different. They had a rhythm, a pattern, almost as if something was trying to communicate. The scratching would start in the evening, after the family had settled down for the night. It would move through the walls, across the ceiling, down into the spaces between the floorboards, as if something small and quick was exploring the hidden passages of the house, learning its way around, making itself at home. James Irving, being a practical man, assumed it was some sort of animal, perhaps a rat that had found its way into the walls, or a family of mice that had taken up residence for the winter. He set traps, checked for holes, did all the sensible things a homeowner does when dealing with unwanted creatures. But the sounds continued, growing bolder, more complex. The pattering became almost musical at times, rhythmic, purposeful, and then, one evening in late September, the impossible happened. The scratching was joined by something else, something that made the Irving family freeze in their chairs and look at each other with wide, startled eyes. A voice, clear, distinct, unmistakably real, came from the walls, a high, sweet voice, almost childlike, speaking in perfect English, with just a hint of an accent that might have been Welsh, or perhaps something older, something from a time before modern languages. "What's that?" the voice said, as clear as if someone were sitting in the room with them. "What's that you're doing?" The words seemed to come from behind the wooden panelling near the fireplace, from a space where no living thing could possibly fit, from a place where voices simply could not be. The family sat in stunned silence. Margaret's knitting forgotten in her lap. James's newspaper rustling as his hands trembled slightly. Voiré staring at the wall with a mixture of fear and fascination that only a 13-year-old can manage. For a long moment, no one spoke, no one moved, no one even breathed. And then James Irving, practical James Irving, cleared his throat and did the most natural thing in the world. He answered. "We're just sitting here by the fire," he said to the empty air, feeling slightly foolish but somehow compelled to respond. "Reading and doing needlework." "Oh," came the reply, immediate and conversational, as if talking through walls was the most normal thing in the world. "That sounds nice. I like to watch people. May I stay and listen?" And so began one of the most extraordinary friendships in the history of the paranormal. A friendship between a family and a voice, between the ordinary world and something that should not have existed. A conversation that would continue for 14 years, bringing joy, wonder, and no small amount of chaos to the quiet life of Cashin's Gap. Meeting Jeff. The voice introduced itself a few days later, with all the politeness of a proper house guest. "My name is Jeff," it said, pronouncing it with a soft G. "I live here now. I hope you don't mind." "What are you?" asked Voiré, with the directness that children possess. "Are you a ghost?" "Oh no," came the reply, sounding almost amused. "I'm not a ghost. I'm a mongoose. An extra clever mongoose. I came from India originally, but I've been travelling for quite some time. I like it here. It's peaceful." Now, mongooses are not native to the Isle of Man. In fact, they're not found anywhere in the British Isles. They're small, quick creatures from Africa and Asia, known for their intelligence and their ability to hunt snakes. The Irving family had never seen one, though they had heard of them from stories of the British Empire. "How did you get here?" James Irving asked, still feeling somewhat absurd to be having a conversation with his walls. "I came on a ship," Jeff replied matter-of-factly. "I was travelling with a family who were visiting India. They were very kind to me, but when they returned to England, I decided to explore. I've been looking for the right place to settle down, and I think I've found it." The conversations continued night after night. Jeff proved to be remarkably talkative. He asked about the family's daily activities, commented on the weather, expressed opinions about current events. He seemed to know things about the outside world that a creature living in the walls couldn't possibly know. "There's going to be a storm tomorrow," he might announce. And sure enough, the next day would bring heavy rains and fierce winds. "The postman is coming early today," he would say, and Mr. Corkill would arrive with the mail hours before his usual time. Jeff claimed to be able to travel around the island at will, to eavesdrop on conversations in the village, to observe the neighbours and report back to the Irving family with gossip and news. He spoke of things happening miles away, events that the isolated family had no way of knowing about, until days later when word would reach them through normal channels. "Mrs. Corrin's cow had her calf last night," Jeff announced one morning. The Irving family lived too far from Mrs. Corrin's farm to have known this. But when James Irving went to the village later that week, he discovered that indeed, Mrs. Corrin's prize cow had delivered a healthy calf on the very night Jeff had mentioned. But perhaps most remarkably, Jeff began to show himself, not fully, not clearly, but in glimpses, in shadows, in movements caught from the corner of the eye. The family would see a small, quick shape darting across a doorway, a flash of yellow fur disappearing behind furniture, tiny paw prints in the dust that were there one moment and gone the next. Voiré was the first to get a clear look at him. She was sitting by her bedroom window one evening, reading by lamplight, when movement in the garden caught her attention. There, sitting on the stone wall that bordered their property, was a small, slender creature about the size of a large rat or small cat. He was beautiful, she would later tell her parents. With golden yellow fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, bright, intelligent eyes that seemed almost human in their expression, a long, bushy tail that he wrapped around himself like a fur stole, and small, delicate paws that he used expressively, almost like hands. When he saw her watching, Jeff didn't flee like a wild animal might. Instead, he seemed to pose, turning his head this way and that, showing off his profile, his whiskers twitching with what could only be described as amusement. Then he stood on his hind legs, gave what appeared to be a little bow, and vanished into the night. "He's beautiful," Voiré told her parents breathlessly, "and he knows he's beautiful. He was showing off for me. I think he likes having an audience." Indeed. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Jeff very much enjoyed having an audience. He would perform for the family, singing songs in his high, sweet voice, telling jokes, even doing what he claimed were impressions of various people from the village. He had, it seemed, a theatrical nature. How are you feeling right now? Has your breathing naturally settled into the gentle rhythm of our story? If you find your thoughts drifting to the stresses of the day, that's perfectly natural. Just gently return your attention to the little farmhouse on the Isle of Man, where an impossible friendship is blossoming between a family and their mysterious houseguest. Life with an extra clever mongoose. As autumn turned to winter in 1931, Jeff settled into life at Cashin's Gap with the contentment of someone who had finally found home. He established routines, preferences, and what could only be described as house rules, though he was, technically, not the one paying rent. He had favourite spots throughout the house. Behind the kitchen stove was his preferred location for conversations. The space between the walls near Voiré's bedroom was where he liked to sing, and the attic, accessible through a small gap in the ceiling, became his private retreat where he would go when he wanted to be alone. Jeff was particular about mealtimes. He would announce when he was hungry, and the family learned to leave small portions of food for him. Bread and milk were his favourites, though he also enjoyed biscuits, cheese, and the occasional bit of meat. The food would disappear during the night, and Jeff would thank them politely the next morning. "That was a lovely bit of cheese," he might say, "the kind with the holes in it. I do appreciate good cheese. In India, we had very different food, much spicier, but I've grown quite fond of Manx cooking." He was also particular about visitors. Some people Jeff liked immediately, and would chatter away to them through the walls, sharing gossip, asking about their families, making them feel welcome. Others he simply ignored, no matter how much they called to him or tried to engage him in conversation. "He knows good people from bad people," Voiré observed. "He only talks to people he trusts. I think he can sense things about people that we can't." Jeff claimed to have many abilities beyond simple conversation. He said he could travel anywhere on the island at will, appearing and disappearing as he pleased. He could, he claimed, make himself invisible when he chose, though he preferred to be seen and admired. He also claimed to be able to influence events, though he was always vague about exactly how. "I helped Mrs. Corkill find her lost sheep yesterday," he announced one morning. "They had wandered down into the glen. I herded them back up to the pasture. She thinks it was her dog, but it was me." The family learned that Jeff had strong opinions about almost everything. He preferred classical music to popular songs, though he would sometimes sing music hall tunes in his high, sweet voice. He disliked rainy weather. Even though he was supposedly from India, where monsoons were common, he was fascinated by politics, and would comment knowledgeably on events in London and around the world. "That Mr. Churchill is quite clever," he might observe, "though I think he talks too much. I prefer people who listen as well as speak, like your family. You're very good listeners." Jeff also proved to be remarkably well informed about local affairs. He seemed to know everyone on the island, their business, their secrets, their relationships. He would share this information with the Irving family, though always in a spirit of friendly gossip rather than malicious intent. Young Tom Carish is going to propose to Mary Clegg next week, he announced one evening. He's been carrying his grandmother's ring around for months. He finally worked up the courage. The proposal will happen by the old church. Ye shall say yes, of course. She's been waiting patiently. When James Irving went to the village the following week, he discovered that indeed. Tom Carish had proposed to Mary Clegg by the old church, and she had accepted. The engagement was announced exactly as Jeff had predicted. The Irving family began to realize that their houseguest possessed knowledge that seemed impossible for any earthly creature. But perhaps most endearing of all, Jeff proved to have a sense of humour. He would play harmless pranks, moving small objects around the house, hiding things in unexpected places, making sounds at just the right moment to startle someone, always followed by his distinctive giggle. "Did you hide my spectacles?" James Irving would ask when his reading glasses went missing. "Perhaps," Jeff would reply with obvious amusement. "They're somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll find them when you really need them." And sure enough, the spectacles would turn up in the most logical place, on the table by James's favourite chair, where they certainly hadn't been when he looked there 10 minutes earlier. Jeff also proved to be protective of the family. He would warn them of visitors approaching long before anyone could be seen on the road. He would alert them to problems with the animals or issues around the farm that needed attention. He seemed to consider himself not just a resident of Cashin's Gap, but its guardian. "There's a man coming up the lane," he would announce. "He's carrying papers, official-looking papers. I think he's from the government. You might want to tidy up a bit." And indeed, a few minutes later, a representative from the local council would appear at their door, briefcase in hand, to discuss some matter of taxation or land use. The family learned to trust Jeff's warnings, and were always prepared for whatever visitors or challenges the day might bring. As winter deepened into spring, and spring blossomed into summer, Jeff became more than just an unusual houseguest. He became part of the family, a constant presence in their daily lives, a voice that greeted them each morning and wished them good night each evening, a friend who shared their joys and comforted them in their sorrows. Word spreads across the island. By the summer of 1932, word of the talking mongoose had begun to spread beyond Cashin's Gap. In a place as small as the Isle of Man, extraordinary news travels quickly, especially when that news involves something as impossible as a conversation with a creature that shouldn't exist. It started with the postman, Mr. Corkill, who had been delivering mail to the Irving family for years. He was a practical, no-nonsense man who prided himself on his punctuality and his knowledge of everyone's business. When he began hearing a strange voice calling to him from inside the house, he was, naturally, quite taken aback. "Good morning, Mr. Corkill," the voice would say as he approached the door. "You're running a bit late today. I hope everything is well with your family." Mr. Corkill would look around confused, seeing no one but knowing that someone had definitely spoken to him. The voice knew his name, knew his routines, seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare. But there was no one there to answer him. "Who's that speaking?" he would call out, feeling somewhat foolish but too curious to ignore the voice. "It's Jeff," came the cheerful reply. I live here. I'm a mongoose. I know all about you. Mr. Corkle, you have 3 children and a very patient wife. You walk 17 miles every day delivering mail, and you have a particular fondness for Mrs. Kelly's scones. Mr. Corkle nearly dropped his mailbag. The voice knew details about his life that even his closest friends might not know. His secret weakness for Mrs. Kelly's baking, the exact distance of his daily route, the private joke about his wife's patience. How could a voice in the walls possibly know such things? When Mr. Corkle shared his experience at the local pub, the reaction was a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and the kind of excitement that comes when something truly unusual happens in a quiet place. Some dismissed his story as imagination, others demanded more details, but everyone wanted to know more about the talking mongoose of Cashin's Gap. Word reached the village doctor, Dr. Price, a learned man who had studied at Edinburgh University and prided himself on his scientific approach to medicine. He was naturally sceptical, but also curious. As a man of science, he felt obligated to investigate claims that challenged the natural order. Dr. Price arranged to visit the Irving family, ostensibly to check on their health, but really to investigate the strange reports he had been hearing. He arrived at Cashin's Gap on a bright afternoon in late summer, carrying his medical bag and his considerable skepticism. The Irving family welcomed him warmly, offered him tea and biscuits, and chatted pleasantly about local affairs. Dr. Price examined each family member thoroughly, finding them all to be in perfect health, both physically and mentally. They showed no signs of delusion, hysteria, or any other condition that might explain the extraordinary claims being made about their household. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Price began to wonder if the whole story had been exaggerated. Perhaps there had been some unusual sounds, some trick of acoustics that had been misinterpreted. He was preparing to take his leave when a clear, distinct voice spoke from somewhere near the ceiling. "Good afternoon, Dr. Price," the voice said pleasantly. "I hope you've enjoyed your visit. The Irving family are wonderful hosts, aren't they?" Dr. Price nearly dropped his teacup. He looked around the room frantically, searching for the source of the voice, but seeing only the Irving family, who were watching his reaction with expressions of gentle amusement. Who is speaking?" Dr. Price managed to stammer. "I'm Jeff," came the reply. "I live here. I've been listening to your conversation. You have a very soothing voice, Dr. Price. I imagine your patients find you quite comforting." Dr. Price spent the next hour in conversation with Jeff, asking medical questions, testing the creature's knowledge, trying to find some rational explanation for what he was experiencing. Jeff proved to be remarkably well informed about medical matters, discussing symptoms and treatments with the expertise of someone who had studied human nature for many years. "Old Mr. Quine in the village has been having trouble with his breathing," Jeff mentioned casually. "He thinks it's just age, but I believe he has fluid in his lungs. You might want to examine him more carefully on your next visit." When Dr. Price checked on Mr. Quine the following week, he discovered that Jeff had been absolutely correct. The old man was indeed suffering from fluid in his lungs, a condition that might have gone undiagnosed for weeks without Jeff's observation. Dr. Price was forced to admit that, whatever Jeff might be, he possessed knowledge and insight that defied conventional explanation. Dr. Price's account of his visit to Cashin's Gap, shared cautiously with his medical colleagues, added credibility to the story of the talking mongoose. Here was an educated man, a scientist, a skeptic, who had personally experienced something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Word of Dr. Price's encounter spread throughout the island, and soon, visitors from across the Irish Sea began making pilgrimages to the little farmhouse in Dalby. Some came as skeptics, hoping to debunk what they assumed was an elaborate hoax. Others came as believers, seeking proof that the world still held mysteries beyond human understanding. Jeff, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention. He would chat with visitors, answer their questions, even perform tricks to amuse them. He particularly enjoyed showing off his knowledge of current events and his ability to predict future occurrences. His accuracy was uncanny, his manner charming, his conversation delightful. But not everyone who visited Cashin's Gap was treated to a performance. Jeff was selective about his audiences. He seemed to judge people's character instantly, and would only speak to those he deemed worthy of his attention. Those he disliked were ignored completely, no matter how much they pleaded or demanded that he speak. "I don't perform for everyone," Jeff explained to the Irving family. "Some people have closed minds, others have unkind hearts. I only speak to people who approach me with respect and genuine curiosity. Life is too short to waste time on fools and skeptics." Take a moment to rest here, to let your mind settle with the gentle impossibility of Jeff's story. If you find yourself wondering how such things could be, that's perfectly natural. The Irving family wondered the same thing every day for 14 years. When you're ready, we'll continue with our tale, as investigators from the mainland arrived to study the most famous mongoose in the world. The investigators arrive. As 1933 dawned, the story of Jeff the Talking Mongoose had travelled far beyond the shores of the Isle of Man. Newspapers in London had picked up the tale. Scientific journals were publishing articles about the phenomenon, and investigators from across Europe were requesting permission to study the remarkable creature of Cashin's Gap. The first serious investigator to arrive was Harry Price, a renowned paranormal researcher who had spent his career studying psychic phenomena, mediums, and unexplained occurrences. Price was a careful, methodical man who approached each case with scientific rigour, bringing instruments, recording equipment, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Price arrived at Cashin's Gap in the spring of 1933, accompanied by his assistant and several cases of scientific equipment. He was prepared for anything, from clever ventriloquism to elaborate mechanical devices. His experience had taught him that most paranormal claims had perfectly rational explanations, once you looked closely enough. The Irving family welcomed Price warmly. They had grown accustomed to visitors by now, and understood that many people needed to witness Jeff for themselves before they could believe such an extraordinary story. They were patient, cooperative, and completely open about their experiences. Price spent several days at Cashin's Gap, examining every inch of the house, looking for hidden speakers, concealed wires, or any mechanical device that might explain the voices. He found nothing. The walls were solid stone, covered with old wooden panelling that had clearly been in place for decades. There were no hidden passages, no spaces large enough to conceal a person, no evidence of trickery. On his second evening at the farmhouse, Price was sitting in the kitchen with the Irving family when Jeff spoke for the first time during his visit. The voice was clear, distinct, and definitely coming from somewhere within the walls, not from any family member or hidden speaker. "Good evening, Mr. Price," Jeff said pleasantly. "I've been waiting for you to settle in. I don't like to rush conversations. How are you finding our little island?" Price was startled but maintained his composure. He had interviewed hundreds of mediums and psychic phenomena, but this was different. The voice had personality, warmth, a conversational quality that seemed completely natural and unforced. "I'm finding it very interesting," Price replied carefully. "I understand you've been living with the Irving family for some time." "Oh yes," Jeff replied cheerfully. "Nearly 2 years now. They're wonderful people. Very kind, very patient. Not everyone would welcome a talking mongoose into their home, but they've made me feel like family." Price spent the next hour in detailed conversation with Jeff, asking probing questions, testing the creature's knowledge, trying to find inconsistencies or evidence of deception. Jeff answered every question thoughtfully, demonstrated knowledge of events happening across the island, and even predicted several occurrences that Price was later able to verify. "There will be a ship arriving in Douglas Harbour tomorrow morning," Jeff announced. "A cargo vessel from Liverpool, carrying supplies for the island. It's running late due to rough seas, but it will dock before noon." The next morning, Price checked with the harbour master in Douglas. A cargo ship from Liverpool had indeed arrived just before noon, delayed by rough weather, exactly as Jeff had predicted. Price was forced to admit that whatever phenomenon he was dealing with, it possessed knowledge that seemed impossible for any earthly creature to obtain. Price also attempted to photograph Jeff, setting up cameras around the house, hoping to capture evidence of the creature's physical form. Jeff proved to be remarkably camera-shy, disappearing whenever the equipment was brought out, though he seemed amused by Price's efforts. "I don't photograph well," Jeff explained with obvious humour. "The camera steals a bit of one's soul, don't you think? Besides, I prefer to remain mysterious. Mystery is much more interesting than proof." Despite his inability to capture definitive proof, Price was convinced that he had encountered something genuinely extraordinary. In his official report, he wrote that the Irving family showed no signs of deception, that the phenomena he witnessed defied conventional explanation, and that Jeff appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, an extra clever mongoose. Price's endorsement brought even more attention to Cashin's Gap. Other investigators arrived, some from universities, others from psychical research societies, a few from newspapers hoping to debunk what they assumed was an elaborate hoax. All left with the same conclusion, that whatever was happening at the Irving farmhouse defied rational explanation. Dr. Nandor Fodor, a respected psychical researcher and author, spent several weeks at Cashin's Gap in 1935. He brought recording equipment, hoping to capture Jeff's voice on tape. The technology was primitive by today's standards, but it was the best available at the time. Jeff was initially reluctant to speak into the recording devices, claiming that the machines made him nervous. "They're so cold and mechanical," he complained. "I prefer conversations with warm, living people, but I suppose, for the sake of posterity, I could try." The recordings that Dr. Fodor made, though faint and scratchy by modern standards, clearly captured a voice that was distinct from any member of the Irving family. The voice had its own speech patterns, its own vocabulary, its own personality. It was, unmistakably, the voice of Jeff. "Hello there," the voice said on one recording. "This is rather exciting, and I've never spoken to a machine before. I hope I'm coming through clearly. I do so want people to understand that I'm real, that I'm here, that I'm part of this wonderful family." Dr. Fodor also documented several instances of Jeff's apparent ability to travel around the island and report back with information that the Irving family could not have known. Jeff would describe events happening in Douglas, the island's capital, give details about ships arriving in the harbour, even report on conversations taking place in the local pub. Mrs. Crellin's granddaughter is visiting from London, Jeff announced one evening. She arrived on the afternoon ferry. She's brought gifts for everyone, including a lovely blue scarf for her grandmother. They're having tea right now in the front parlour, discussing the weather in England. When Dr. Fodor checked the next day, he discovered that Mrs. Crellin's granddaughter had indeed arrived from London on the afternoon ferry, bringing gifts including a blue scarf, and had spent the evening discussing English weather with her grandmother. Once again, Jeff had demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible for any creature confined to a farmhouse. Perhaps most remarkably, several investigators reported actually seeing Jeff, though these sightings were brief and occurred under dim lighting conditions. The descriptions were consistent: a small, yellowish creature about the size of a large rat, with bright, intelligent eyes and a bushy tail, moving with incredible speed and agility. Dr. Fodor managed to glimpse Jeff on several occasions, describing him as a creature of remarkable beauty and obvious intelligence, moving with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. His eyes held an awareness that was definitely not animal, but something far more sophisticated. The investigators also documented Jeff's playful nature, his love of pranks and practical jokes, his delight in moving objects around the house, hiding things in unexpected places, creating minor chaos just for the amusement of surprising people. "Where did you put Dr. Fodor's pen?" Voirrey would ask when the researcher's writing instrument went missing. "Somewhere safe," Jeff would reply with obvious glee. "Somewhere he'll find it when he stops looking so hard. Humans always make things more complicated than they need to be." The pen would inevitably turn up in the most obvious place, on the table where Dr. Fodor was working, where it certainly hadn't been when he looked there minutes earlier. These small pranks became a regular part of life at Cashin's Gap, adding an element of playful chaos to the household routine. The war years. As the 1930s progressed into the 1940s, the world outside the Isle of Man was changing dramatically. War clouds were gathering over Europe, and even the peaceful isolation of Cashin's Gap could not completely shield the Irving family from the growing tensions of a world preparing for conflict. Jeff proved to be remarkably well informed about international affairs. He would comment knowledgeably on political developments, predict military movements, and express concern about the approaching war. His knowledge seemed to come from sources that the Irving family could not identify, as if he had access to information networks beyond normal human reach. "There will be war soon," Jeff announced in the summer of 1939. "Mr. Hitler has gone too far. The other countries will have no choice but to fight. It will be a long war, a difficult war, but in the end, good will triumph over evil, though the cost will be terrible." When war was officially declared in September of 1939, Jeff's prediction proved accurate. The conflict would indeed be long and difficult, lasting 6 years and touching every corner of the world, including the supposedly peaceful Isle of Man. During the war years, the island became a crucial staging area for Atlantic convoys. Airfields were built, military personnel were stationed throughout the area, and the quiet rural life that the Irving family had always known was disrupted by the constant presence of wartime activity. Jeff seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. His conversations became more serious, more focused on matters of global importance. He spoke with genuine concern about the suffering caused by the war, the families separated by conflict, the young men who would never return home. "I see the planes flying overhead," he would say sadly. "So many young pilots, boys really, flying off to fight in foreign skies. Some will return, but too many will not. War is such a waste of young life, of human potential." But Jeff also used his abilities to help with the war effort. He would report on aircraft movements, identify planes by their sound alone, and even predict when air raids might threaten the island. His warnings proved invaluable to the Irving family and their neighbors, allowing them to take shelter when danger approached. "German planes tonight," he would announce. 3 bombers, flying high, they're not targeting the island, just passing through on their way to Liverpool. But take shelter anyway. One never knows when pilots might change their minds." Jeff's predictions about air activity proved remarkably accurate. He could distinguish between British and German aircraft by sound alone, identify the type and number of planes, and predict their likely targets. Local authorities began to take notice, though officially they could never acknowledge that their intelligence came from a talking mongoose. As the war progressed, Jeff also demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict which local young men would return safely from military service and which would not. He spoke with deep sadness about the boys who would not see their families again, but also with joy about those who would survive to build new lives in peacetime. "Young Tommy Courish will come home," he announced when the boy shipped out with the Royal Navy. "He'll see action in the Mediterranean, dangerous times, but he has a strong spirit, a will to survive. He'll return to marry his sweetheart and raise a family." Tommy Courish did indeed return safely from the war, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 4 children on the island, just as Jeff had predicted. Such accurate predictions about human destiny became commonplace during the war years, adding to the growing legend of the remarkable Mongoose of Cashen's Gap. But the war years also brought sadness to the household. James Irving, now in his 70s, began to show his age. The stress of wartime, the constant stream of visitors, and the burden of being the human representative of an impossible phenomenon all took their toll on his health. Jeff showed remarkable sensitivity to James's declining health. He would speak more quietly when the old man was resting, avoid his usual pranks when James was feeling unwell, and even sing gentle lullabies to help him sleep on nights when pain kept him awake. "Rest well, dear James," Jeff would whisper through the walls. "You've been a good friend to me, a kind host, a patient listener. Sleep peacefully and know that you are loved." James Irving passed away in 1945, just as the war was ending. He died peacefully in his sleep, with his family around him, and with Jeff's gentle voice singing softly in the background. The old man's last words were a whispered thank you to the impossible creature who had brought such wonder into his final years. The beginning of the end. James Irving's death marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Jeff, but also, sadly, the beginning of the end. Without the patriarch's steady presence, the dynamics of Cashen's Gap began to change. Margaret Irving, now widowed and approaching 70, found it increasingly difficult to manage the constant stream of visitors who came seeking audience with Jeff. Voiré, now a young woman in her 20s, had grown up with Jeff as her constant companion, but she was beginning to feel the need for a life beyond the walls of the farmhouse. She'd received proposals of marriage, job offers from the mainland, opportunities to build a normal life away from the extraordinary circumstances of her childhood. Jeff seemed to sense the changing atmosphere in the household. His conversations became less frequent, his appearances more rare. He seemed to understand that the family was entering a new phase of their lives, one that might not have room for a talking mongoose, no matter how extra clever he might be. "Things change," he said sadly one evening. "People grow. Families evolve. What once seemed impossible becomes complicated. I understand. I've always understood. Nothing lasts forever, not even the most beautiful friendships." The post-war years brought new challenges to the Isle of Man. Tourism was increasing. Modern conveniences were arriving. The old ways of life were gradually giving way to a more connected, more sceptical world. The isolation that had once protected Cashin's Gap from outside scrutiny was disappearing. Newspaper reporters arrived with more sophisticated equipment, photographers with better cameras, investigators with more advanced recording devices, all hoping to capture definitive proof of Jeff's existence. But Jeff, perhaps sensing the changing times, became increasingly elusive. "I don't like all these machines," he complained. "They make everything so clinical, so cold. The magic disappears when you try too hard to measure it. Some things are meant to be experienced, not documented." As 1947 approached, it became clear that Margaret Irving could no longer maintain the farmhouse. The constant visitors, the financial burden, the physical demands of rural life all proved too much for a woman approaching 70. The decision was made to sell Cashin's Gap and move to a smaller home in Douglas. When the family announced their intention to leave, Jeff's response was characteristically philosophical. "All good things must end," he said quietly. 14 years is a long time for any friendship. We've had wonderful times together, created beautiful memories, shared impossible experiences. That's more than most friends can say. "Will you come with us?" Voiré asked, tears in her voice. "Will you live in our new house?" "No, dear Voiré," Jeff replied gently. "My time with your family is ending. I belong to Cashin's Gap, to this valley, to these stone walls that have been my home. It's time for you to build a new life, a normal life, without the burden of an impossible mongoose." Farewell to an extra clever friend. The Irving family's last night at Cashin's Gap was filled with bittersweet emotion. They had spent 16 years in the little farmhouse, 14 of them with their remarkable houseguest. The walls that had once seemed ordinary had become the backdrop for one of the most extraordinary friendships in the history of the paranormal. Jeff spoke for hours that final evening, reminiscing about their time together, sharing memories of conversations and pranks and quiet moments of companionship. His voice was gentle, nostalgic, touched with the sadness that comes when chapters end and new beginnings must start. "Do you remember," he said softly, "that first night when I asked if I could stay and listen? You could have ignored me, dismissed me as imagination, but instead you welcomed me, made me part of your family, gave me a home. That kindness, that openness to the impossible, that's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." He spoke about the investigators who had visited, the skeptics who had tried to debunk him, the believers who had sought proof of his existence. They all missed the point, he said with gentle amusement. It was never about proving anything. It was about connection, about friendship, about the magic that happens when different kinds of beings choose to care for each other. As dawn approached, Jeff's voice grew fainter, more distant, as if he was already beginning to fade back into the realm of mystery from which he had emerged. "I want you to know," he whispered, "that these have been the happiest years of my very long life. You gave me something I had never experienced before. You gave me family. Will we ever see you again? Margaret Irving asked, her voice breaking with emotion. Perhaps, Jeff replied, his voice now barely audible. If you ever need me, truly need me, I'll try to find you. But you won't need me. You're strong. You're kind. You're capable of creating your own magic. Take care of each other, and remember, sometimes the most impossible things are the most real. Those were the last words Jeff ever spoke to the Irving family. As the sun rose on their final morning at Cashin's Gap, the little farmhouse was silent. The voice that had filled their lives with wonder for 14 years was gone, leaving only echoes and memories and the certainty that they had experienced something truly extraordinary. The Irving family moved to Douglas, where they lived quietly for the rest of their lives. They rarely spoke publicly about their years with Jeff, preferring to keep those memories private, sacred, protected from a world that demanded proof rather than simply accepting wonder. Margaret Irving lived until 1961, always maintaining that every word of the Jeff story was true, that their impossible house guest had been exactly what he claimed to be, an extra clever mongoose who had chosen to share his life with theirs. Voiré Irving married and raised a family of her own. She lived until 2005, and throughout her long life, she never wavered in her account of the talking mongoose. He was real, she would say simply. He was our friend. He brought joy and magic into our lives. That's all that matters. The mystery continues, and Cashin's Gap was sold to new owners who had no interest in talking mongooses or paranormal phenomena. They renovated the old farmhouse, modernized the interior, and lived their lives in blessed normalcy. If Jeff still resided in the walls, he kept his presence to himself. Over the years, various investigators returned to the farmhouse, hoping to find evidence of Jeff's continued presence, or perhaps to solve the mystery of his existence once and for all. None succeeded. The house remained stubbornly ordinary, offering no clues to the extraordinary events that had once taken place within its walls. Some skeptics claimed that the entire story had been an elaborate hoax, perpetrated by the Irving family for reasons of publicity or financial gain. But this theory never held up to scrutiny. The Irvings gained nothing from their association with Jeff. In fact, the constant stream of visitors and investigators made their lives more difficult, not easier. Others suggested that Voiré Irving had been a gifted ventriloquist, creating the voice of Jeff through some form of vocal trickery. But this explanation also failed to account for the knowledge that Jeff displayed, his accurate predictions, his awareness of events happening far from Cashin's Gap. Psychologists proposed that the family had experienced some form of shared delusion, a mass hysteria that created the illusion of a talking mongoose. But the investigators who witnessed Jeff, the recordings that captured his voice, the documented predictions that proved accurate, all argued against a purely psychological explanation. The truth is, no one has ever provided a satisfactory explanation for Jeff. He remains what he always was, a mystery, an impossibility, a reminder that the world still holds wonders that defy our understanding. Perhaps that's exactly as it should be. How are you feeling as our story draws toward its close? Has your breathing settled into the peaceful rhythm of rest? If sleep is calling to you, let it come naturally, like Jeff himself appeared, unexpectedly, gently, bringing magic into an ordinary evening. You're safe here, in this space between waking and dreaming, where impossible things feel possible, and wonder is always welcome. The legacy of Jeff. Today, more than 70 years after Jeff last spoke to the Irving family, his story continues to fascinate people around the world. He has become a legend of the Isle of Man, remembered in local folklore, celebrated in tourist guides, immortalized in books and documentaries about the paranormal. But perhaps Jeff's greatest legacy is not his fame, but the reminder he provides that the world is far stranger, far more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. In an age of science and skepticism, his story stands as a testament to the power of wonder, the importance of keeping our minds open to impossible possibilities. The Irving family's willingness to welcome Jeff into their home, to accept his impossible presence with grace and kindness, offers a model for how we might approach the mysteries that still surround us. Instead of demanding proof, perhaps we can simply experience. Instead of needing explanations, perhaps we can simply wonder. Jeff claimed to be an extra clever mongoose, but perhaps he was something even more remarkable. Perhaps he was a reminder, a messenger, a gentle teacher sent to show us that magic still exists in the world, if only we have the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to welcome it into our lives. In a world that often feels cold and mechanical, full of machines and measurements, Jeff's story reminds us of the importance of warmth, of connection, of the simple joy that comes from sharing our lives with others, even when those others happen to be impossible talking mongooses. The investigators who visited Cashin's Gap, the skeptics who tried to debunk the story, the believers who sought proof of the paranormal, all missed the most important point. Jeff's reality was never about evidence or explanation. It was about love, about friendship, about the magic that happens when beings choose to care for each other across the boundaries of species, of possibility, of understanding. A gentle good night. As our journey with Jeff comes to an end, take a moment to appreciate the wonder he brought into the world. For 14 years, a small farmhouse on a remote island was home to something impossible, something beautiful, something that challenged everything we think we know about reality. Whether Jeff was a real mongoose, a supernatural entity, or something else entirely, matters less than the joy he brought to the Irving family, the wonder he inspired in visitors, the reminder he provided that the world still holds mysteries beyond our comprehension. Feel yourself settling now, like Jeff settling into his favourite spot behind the kitchen stove. Feel your thoughts becoming as gentle as his evening conversations. Feel your body relaxing like the peaceful atmosphere of Cashin's Gap on a quiet summer evening. You're safe here, in this space between day and night, between the possible and impossible, between waking and dreaming. Let yourself drift like Jeff drifting through the walls of the old farmhouse, exploring, discovering, finding comfort in hidden places. Your breath can slow like the gentle rhythm of island life. Your thoughts can quiet like the peaceful conversations between friends. Your body can rest like Margaret Irving's knitting, set aside at the end of a peaceful day. There's nothing you need to prove, nothing you need to explain. Just like Jeff, you can simply be, simply exist, simply rest in the knowledge that you are part of a world that still holds magic, still offers wonder, still welcomes the impossible with open arms. May your dreams be filled with gentle voices, with impossible friends, with the kind of magic that makes ordinary places feel extraordinary. May you rest in the peace that comes from knowing that somewhere, in some hidden corner of the world, wonder is always waiting to surprise us. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember Jeff's gentle wisdom. that the most impossible things are often the most real, and that true magic happens not when we demand proof, but when we open our hearts to wonder. Good night from all of us, including one extra clever mongoose, who reminds us that the world is far more wonderful than we ever dared imagine.